so my name is William George. My background is as a mathematician. Now I do research for Kleros. So I'm going to tell you a little more about, following up on what Clement was talking about earlier, some of the cryptoeconomic research questions that we've been looking at. So a lot of our core research questions are sort of these mechanism design questions of how do we design a system like Kleros, a blockchain-based, cloud source-based dispute resolution system, in such a way that people will be incentivized to participate honestly, and then that the system can convert this sort of honest participation, these like honest votes from jurors, into good outcomes generally seen as being fair and honest. So like a first natural question when you're saying, okay, what does honest participation look like, is to say, look at some forms of dishonest participation, identify them, disincentivize them. So an obvious dishonest thing that one could do as a juror is you've been selected to a case, and like ideally an honest strategy would be to like carefully look at the evidence, look at the policies, examine the website for the freelancer website or dispute, and make a careful ruling based on the best information that your effort and time can come up with. A dishonest strategy, an obvious dishonest strategy is like, I'm just going to vote randomly. I've been chosen to be a juror. There's a potential payout if I'm coherent. This analysis is looking at the website, that's way too much work. I'm just going to pick something and hope for the best. So we call that a lazy strategy. A somewhat more sophisticated lazy strategy sort of touches at your question earlier to say, okay, like I'm looking at a freelancer website dispute, and I can look statistically at all the previous freelancer website disputes, and I see that 80% of them went for the freelancer. So I'm going to just vote for the freelancer. The odds are on my side, and I'm going to hope for the best. And if too many jurors do that, then you cycle out of control to the point where everyone is voting for the freelancer, and then you sort of have a useless system. So this kind of behavior should be disincentivized. And how can we do that? Well, we have sort of two major parameters, two levers that we can pull on to try to tune the incentives of our jurors. So they are paid a certain fee for if they are coherent, if they vote for the winning side, there's a fee split between them. So that fee is a parameter. We can move that up or down via a governance vote. So these fees these parameters are determined by a sort of governance vote. The token holders vote on these fees, and they're incentivized to try to have Kleros be a useful system. But regardless, when you're setting the fees, like you can move the arbitration fees up or down. And the other sort of big parameter that we have in play here is the deposit. I, as a juror, put in a deposit, a stake in PNK, and if I'm not coherent, I lose that. So if the arbitration fees are really high, then that might tempt people to be dishonest. It's like, I can get a lot of arbitration fees. So even if I'm like only coherent, like a percentage of the time, by that percentage of the time, I get this huge arbitration fee. It's totally worth it to me to like vote honestly or dishonestly. In particularly, I might be incentivized to be lazy. But then on the other hand, I can move the deposit up and down. And if the deposit is really big, if I have a large risk of money that I might lose if I'm non-coherent, well, then I might think twice about voting lazily. That there's money on the line. I have to take this seriously. So you want to pick these parameters in a way that will encourage people to participate honestly. And ultimately, right. So currently, like you can have more and more sophisticated models. For the moment, the models we use when we choose our parameters are pretty simplistic. I admit they've worked pretty well so far, but we can have more and more complicated models that based on more and more sort of experimental data and like look carefully at empirical data based on who our pool of jurors is, and that is among research that we'll be doing forward. But currently, our model is basically that we try to estimate an amount of effort that a juror will take to evaluate a case. So if they employ the honest strategy, they automatically just lose that effort, versus if they do the lazy strategy, that effort's gone, they've spent time looking at the case. And we assume that people are neutral to risk of it. If you make them put their own risk, so obviously you would expect that they're not picking up necessarily risk neutrality, but rather risk lovers. That's reasonable. And a more sophisticated model will totally take that kind of reasoning into account. That's research going forward in the future. But so, like with the simple model that I just described, you can say, okay, like I'm risk neutral, so what I care about is my expected value. More sophisticated sophisticated model, I have a utility function that takes into place my expected value and my risk, sure. And if I can think about like what the expected values of the different strategies of the lazy strategy and the honest strategy are given the different parameters. So here in this chart, I have like the arbitration fees on the x-axis and the expected values of the two strategies on the y-axis. The deposit size is not shown. That would be another dimension. But if you change the deposit size, these are like lines. The honest strategy and the lazy strategy are going to move around. So ultimately what you want to do is you want to choose like the parameters. So the honest strategy is positive and the lazy strategy is negative, like as a minimum. So that people are disincentivized to being lazy, that they'll lose money on average, like it is worth less than not participating to be lazy. And it's worth more than not participating if people are incentivized to come and be honest. And notice there's these are kind of like supply curves. There's an element of like a supply and demand kind of reasoning here, in that you know, as a juror, I'm a provider of dispute resolution services. So I can think of these curves as my like particularly the honest strategy curve as a supply curve for dispute resolution, and there's like a demand curve where people are willing to pay for dispute resolution. So you have sort of similar kind of like price determination reasoning that you have in classical supply and demand problems. Only now there's this extra dimension of like, I also have to be secure against these kinds of lazy attacks. So I have to take that into account too. And like luckily, with this extra constraint, I also have an extra degree of freedom because I have this extra parameter. In addition to fees, there's also this deposit size. So I have a little more freedom in choosing a somewhat more complicated constraint problem to determine like what should my parameters be. So this is one aspect of our research, to have more realistic models, better models, to be able to come up with the best incentives that our parameters can choose. Okay, so another subject of our research so far is on sort of the voting system and social choice theory inspired questions relating to our voting system. So if in like a simple voting system is called the plurality, is an example, it's what we currently use, is the plurality voting system, which in the language of social choice theorists. This is also known as first past the post. This system is famously used in democratic elections in the United States and the United Kingdom. So this system is as follows. Everyone will be provided with a list of candidates. They'll be able to choose one candidate, and then you take the candidate that has the most votes and they win. And you don't, even if that candidate only has a plurality. So this system is famously problematic. There are all kinds of strategic voting, tactical voting problems that can create voting paradoxes, as we'll see in a second. Maybe if I have similar candidates, they'll split the vote between each other. Maybe if I don't think my vote will be useful, I'll be incentivized not to, I'll vote for somebody else because I don't want to waste my vote. And in Kleros, like, in sort of Schelling point game-based voting, the incentives are different. Because if I'm voting for a democratic election, what I really want is for the candidate that I like best to win. Here, I don't really care who wins. I just want to optimize my economic return. So the incentives are quite different. But nonetheless, a lot of the same kind of pathological phenomena from social choice theory manifest themselves here in different ways. So we had these problems with plurality voting before about vote splitting and wasted votes. And here we see kind of similar phenomena. Like imagine in my freelance dispute case with the website, with the small business owner and the website developer, the website freelancer. Imagine that my choices that are written into the smart contract when the two parties agreed to the original smart contract are as follows. Either Alice will get refunded, Bob will be paid, or maybe I'll give Bob more time. And maybe there'll be several options where I give Bob more time to try to like fix the website and eventually get paid. Maybe there's an option to give Bob 7 more days. Maybe there's an option to give Bob 8 more days. Maybe there's an option to give Bob 9 more days. If there are all of these options in a plurality voting system, you sort of expect the votes between the jurors who are trying to be honest and be like, yeah, Bob should get more time. I want to vote for an honest choice, which is Bob getting more time, to be split between the different choices. And then probably none of them are going to win. So if I'm a juror, I can anticipate this. And I can say, oh, like I probably shouldn't vote for one of the more time options, even though I think that's honest, because it's probably not going to win, the vote's going to be split. And in fact, from sort of a Schelling point of view, that dishonest option of just refunding honest Alice, it's simple, just refund Alice, that's distinguished now, because there's this sea of honest options and a single dishonest option. So now maybe the Schelling point sort of logic can go against us, where the distinguished option is now a dishonest option. So this voting system is quite problematic. And up to this point, basically all of our Kleros disputes have been effectively binary. To the degree that they've had more than two choices, usually the third choice is something that, like, there will only be two choices that could practically reasonably win. The other choices are things like, I refuse to arbitrate because I think this case could touch illegal activities or something, which is realistically not going to happen very often, so the cases are de facto binary. But as we move to more complicated disputes, future use cases, we want to have a greater range of decision-making ability, so we want to be able to have broader non-binary choices. Another problem with plurality is that Clement was talking about 51% attacks, where I, as an attacker, try to take over 51% of the vote to rig the vote. If there are a bunch of choices, maybe I don't need 51% of the vote. Maybe the winning choices are only going to have 30%. Maybe that's all I need. So another weakness of plurality. So instead, a solution that people often use in democratic elections to get around this problems with first past the post is they use what's called ranked choice voting. For example, in Australia, they use a system where you rank your candidates for parliamentary elections 1 to n. I'll rank my favorite candidate first, my second favorite candidate second, and so on. And then you take all the candidates, you look at how many first choice votes they get. Whoever gets the least first choice votes is eliminated. Then you distribute those first choice votes to that candidate's second choices, the voters of the candidate's second choices, and you keep going, eliminating whoever lasts each time until eventually somebody gets a majority. So this is called instant runoff because it simulates a series of runoffs. But there are a whole lot of different kinds of voting systems that one can use to convert this kind of information of a list of these are my preferences of my candidates into an outcome. And unfortunately, all of these systems have some degree of tactical voting in them. There's a famous theorem of Kenneth Arrow, Arrow's impossibility theorem, that says that as long as the only information provided by voters is a list of ranked choices, there will be some situations in which people will be incentivized to vote tactically. And these kinds of pathologies, again, even though our Schelling point-based voting has a different incentive structure, people aren't incentivized in the same way as just wanting their candidate to win, they manifest themselves in our world as well. But then, just as people still have elections anyway, even though they don't resign themselves to the fact that, oh, there will always be some tactical voting, like practically when people have governments organize elections, they pick a voting system that sort of works more or less well, that minimizes the tactical voting and produces good results most of the time. So then the question is, okay, in Kleros, what kind of voting system can we use that will produce good results most of the time and minimize these tactical voting effects? Still my last point on the sort of classical world. In classical voting systems, there are all these different properties that are like different kinds of tactical voting. And I'm like, oh, I want to have the property that if I participate and I vote my true preferences, I should always do better than I don't vote at all. That's one sort of tactical voting criteria. There are all these different top-to-top tactical voting criteria. And like on the left are all the different sort of ranked choice ballot systems. And you can see that some have some and some have don't. So there's a set of trade-offs. It's like, well, it's really important for me to have this property, so I'm willing to sacrifice this other property to get it. And in Kleros, we want to choose voting and incentive systems that, again, encourage people to vote honestly, and then aggregate those votes into an honest collective decision, even when the choice is non-binary. So you have to sort of, the incentive system is closely tied to the voting system. And then there's the question, how do I generalize a Schelling system? Like I'm rewarded if I'm coherent. What does it mean to be coherent now if there are more than two choices? Well, as a candidate incentive system, which is more or less what we're going for a slightly more complex version of this. Basically what's going to happen is that if I provide a list of ranked choices, and then wherever I rank the eventual winner, say I rank the eventual winner third, say I rank the eventual winner second, then I'll lose like a part of my deposit because I didn't put them first. And if I rank them third, I'll lose twice as much of my deposit as if I'd ranked them second, and so on. So then a percentage of my deposit that I lose for not ranking them first is proportional to the number of places down the list that I rank them. And then similarly, lost deposits and arbitration fees are redistributed in a sort of similar way, where the higher up that I am, the more I get. And you can prove that under those formula that if you think that you have some prior for how likely you think given outcomes are going to be, I think that candidate A has a 40% chance of winning, candidate B is at 30%, and candidate C has a then under those payoffs I just showed, you can show that if you believe that the outcome is independent of your vote, then ranking the choices to your highest most probable, to the second most probable, to the third most probable, is incentive compatible. That will optimize your payoffs. And in Kleros, because we have an appeal system, it's not implausible to think that the outcome is independent of my vote. Because if the outcome is bad, if I think that it's wrong, it might be appealed. It's not, it's not a perfect assumption, but like as it is. So that I should be incentivized to be, okay, I think number 1 here is the most likely, and number 2 is the second most likely, and number 3 is the third most likely. And number 4, the dishonest one, I think he's very unlikely, so I'm going to rank him last. And then, when I pair that with the voting system, what kinds of properties can I have? Well, a key property that comes from the old world of social choice theory, that should be inherited from whatever voting system we choose, it's already studied by social choice theorists, is the property of clone independence, or clone resistance. So this gets back to my point earlier, that I don't want my vote to be split between these honest choices here, particularly in a Schelling point system, where that could make the dishonest choice distinguished. I want the honest choices to sort of be seen as like a set of clones that are together, so that if I vote for one, I'm really voting for any of the 3 of them. So basically the property of clone independence says that if I have these 3 angels here, the devil shouldn't be more likely to win than if there was just 1 angel. And there's a formal definition of that. But you can look at whether some properties, some ranked choice voting systems have that, some don't. We would probably want the system to be easy to understand. This is even more so important than probably voting systems in classical democratic elections, because for Kleros jurors, I will have to simulate how other jurors are going to think, and to some degree how the voting system is going to translate that into a result. So I don't want to create a lot of additional effort to the jurors just thinking how the voting system is going to translate results. I want it to be sort of fairly transparent. I want my voting system to be attack resistant. This is primordial in a blockchain-based system where attacks are rampant because anyone can spin up a smart contract that will enforce some kind of fraud. So attack resistance in crypto economics and for us often means economic resistance. It should be expensive to attack something. If I attack Kleros, I should blow more money than I make by attacking the system. And that can depend on the voting system, just as we saw with plurality, that because plurality reduced 51% attack resistance to some lower threshold, that reduced attack resistance. So we should be resistant to those kinds of phenomena. So I won't talk too much about this, but there's a property in certain strains of classical social choice theory on interpreting certain voting systems as maximum likelihood estimators. And this gets to this idea of how the voting system translates the honest inputs of people trying to vote and ranking their choices in order into outcomes that are sort of collectively honest. And then you can look at different voting systems, and we have the same sort of trade-off we had with before, where I can't basically have everything, but I try to choose voting systems that have most of the properties I want. If I choose instant runoff, I'm clone independent, that's great. I don't have as much maximum likelihood estimation. I'm not as good there. My attack resistance is better. Maybe I'm a little more complicated to understand. And then if I consider other properties, I can go down the line. There are trade-offs to it. We're expecting to use instant runoff in Kleros. We're still doing research here, but at least in the short term, that is sort of our plan. That seems like an acceptable set of trade-offs. So how am I doing on time? Okay. So just briefly, there are other research topics we're looking at. Again, attacks are rampant in blockchain world because it's so easy to spin up a blockchain smart contract-based attack. So there's this very interesting kind of bribe that was explored by Vitalik Buterin called a P plus Epsilon attack, which targets specifically Schelling-based systems. We try to warp the incentive structure. So we've done some research studying this and how we can make Kleros resistant to these kinds of attacks. Here, imagine you have this payoff matrix where if I vote X and majority is X, I get P. If I vote Y and majority is Y, I get P. Otherwise, I get 0. Vitalik Buterin asks, okay, what if the majority is X and the attacker pays everyone who votes Y P plus Epsilon? So now voting Y is a dominant strategy. You've warped the incentive matrix. If I'm a voter, I'm like, well, I could vote X and be honest. But if I vote Y and the majority is X, well, I get a little better than if I voted X. And if the majority is Y and I vote Y, I get way more than if I voted X. So I should vote Y now. And then the idea is that the insidious part of this attack is the attacker can say, okay, there's a P plus Epsilon attack available. I can, with a credible commitment to being able to pay the attack. And everyone's like, well, I should vote for the attacker because that's a dominant strategy for me. But then the attacker wins, so the attacker doesn't actually pay any bribes. So it's actually free from the perspective of the attacker. So this is really problematic. So we've designed Kleros to make this attack harder. Where now we have a payout matrix that looks like this instead of the one I had before. It's a little more complicated. But basically, this takes into account that there's a redistribution of arbitration fees and the lost deposits from the people who were wrong to the people who were right. And that doesn't seem like a really structural change. It's the same kind of idea. It's still a shelling game system. But now, if I vote for my honest choice and the attacker gets a majority in a round, say everybody else in my round votes for the attacker but me, then there might be an appeal because we have an appeal system. And if maybe the attacker doesn't have the money to lock up to bribe all the appeal jurors, then I will win and I'll be rewarded because I'm the coherent one. But that means that I get the way the system Kleros works, I'll get the lost deposits of everyone else in my round. So I'll actually get like a positive D from each one of the other n-1 jurors, and in order for the attacker to keep me on board so that I don't defect and vote against, for it to be a dominant strategy for me to accept the bribe, well, the attacker has to pay me m-1D, they're m jurors, so the attacker has to shell out OM squared bribes, but that means the attacker budget is actually growing faster than the PNK in stake. So you can get to the point, because with this extra square, that the lockup is growing faster than the amount that it might exceed all of PNK at some point. So this small change of how we organize the payout structure has asymptotic differences. So just briefly, future research. Blockchains are public. Every transaction is visible to everyone. So we're thinking about ways that we can increase privacy in Kleros. You can encrypt information on a blockchain, but then it can't be used in the consensus process because the nodes don't know what it's saying. But you can do things with zero-knowledge proofs. So as a simple example, imagine a user wanted to show that her flight was canceled without publicly saying what flight that it was. It's like a flight insurance kind of thing. If Kleros has been used to find out, establish a list of canceled flights, then I can issue a zero-knowledge proof against that list without actually saying what flight my flight was. And I can be paid for my insurance contract without anyone ever knowing which flight I had. That might be useful. So we're exploring ways that you can do things like this. There are questions about interoperability with other chains. How can Kleros live on multiple different chains without sort of dividing the community? It's useful to have a sort of a common network because that increases resistance to 51% attacks. It allows greater specialization because you can have more specialized jurors and a larger pool. We want Kleros to live on different chains, so there are cross-chain communications. We're looking into that. And then there's scalability issues, when you have a blockchain, every transaction is being processed by every node. That requires a certain computational overhead. And if Kleros really takes off and has lots of transactions, that might stress the capacity of the network. So what can we do to sort of make Kleros have a lighter footprint and be more scalable? Well, there are ways that you can basically limit the number of transactions that Kleros needs using state channels. I won't really go into that. But there are ways that this can sort of be addressed. Okay, so just to conclude, the protocol designs and parameter choices we make, we want it to be resistant to attacks, lazy strategy attacks, people's Epsilon attacks, other attacks. There are tons of them. There's sort of a balance between the different kinds of attacks that we have to consider and how we parameterize and design the network. And at the same time, you want the voting system to be able to accommodate possibilities with more than 2 outcomes, and we have these future research questions. It's a broad new field, so I'll wrap up there. Oh yeah, sorry. So if you want more information on these topics, we just wrote a sort of technical version of our white paper. We call it the yellow paper, that we'll be putting out today or imminently. That is all details on the sort of our model, the choices we made, why, proofs for sort of security properties under different kinds of models. And to some degree, both our current research and the sketches of what we're going to do research in the future. So I invite you to read that if you're interested in these questions.